Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. When Austin got the call about the night shift guard position at Oak Hollow Funeral Home, he thought it was too good to be true. $30 an hour to sit in an office and patrol the halls of a morgue? Easy money, especially for someone like him. After years of active duty in the military, he wasn't scared of much. Ghost stories didn't faze him, and the idea of walking past a few dead bodies during his rounds didn't so much as make him flinch. The manager, a wiry man named Carl, met him in the front office on his first night. Carl didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The job's simple," Carl said, sliding a clipboard across the desk. "Walk the building once every hour. Make sure no one's trying to break in or cause trouble. Cameras will pick up most of it, but we like a human presence. Oh, and one last thing." Carl's eyes narrowed as he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Under no circumstances are you to open the cooler doors." Austin raised an eyebrow. "The cooler doors? You mean where the bodies are?" Carl nodded, his expression dead serious. "I don't care what you hear, what you think you see, or what someone might tell you. Don't open them. Got it?" Austin smirked but nodded. "Got it." Carl's tone shifted back to casual as he handed over the keys. "Great. Have a good night." Austin shrugged it off. He'd heard weirder rules in his life. As Carl left, he settled into the small office, sipping his coffee and watching the monitors. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The halls of Oak Hollow were quiet, the kind of stillness that felt heavier than normal silence. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound as Austin made his rounds. The cooler doors, thick metal slabs with small windows, stood at the end of a hallway like sentinels. He glanced at them as he passed, his reflection briefly staring back from the glass. Around 2 a.m., he heard the first sound. It started as a low whisper, faint and distant, like someone muttering a prayer. Austin stopped mid-step, his hand instinctively reaching for his flashlight. He swept the beam down the hall. Nothing. The whisper grew louder, turning into a soft, desperate cry. It was coming from behind the cooler doors. "Help! Please! Let me out!" Austin's heart thudded in his chest, but his training kicked in. He approached the cooler cautiously, peering through the small window. The rows of shrouded bodies lay still. He tapped the glass with the butt of his flashlight. "Hello? Is someone there?" he called. The crying stopped instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. He shook his head and turned to walk away, but then came the scream, a blood-curdling wail that froze him in his tracks. It wasn't just a scream of fear. It was pain, agony, and something else he couldn't quite place. Against every instinct, Austin reached for the handle of the cooler door. His hand hovered there for a moment, Carl's warning echoing in his mind. He stepped back. "Nope, not breaking the rule," he muttered, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. If someone was messing with him, he'd find out. That night, he dug through the supply closet and rigged a series of makeshift traps, fishing lines strung across the hallway, bells tied to door handles, and even a few tripwires. If anything moved, he'd know. By the time his shift ended, the funeral home was quiet again, but the unease lingered. He told himself it was just a prank, a trick of the mind in a creepy setting. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. As he stepped into the cool morning air, he decided he'd bring some extra gear with him the next night, just in case. Austin arrived for his second shift armed and ready. He'd brought a spool of extra fishing line, a set of small bells, and even a handful of motion-activated lights he picked up at the hardware store. If someone, or something, was messing with him, he'd know. The evening started quietly, much like the night before. Austin spent the first hour setting up his traps. He strung fishing line across the hallway outside the cooler room, attaching bells to the ends so any disturbance would sound an alert. The motion lights were positioned strategically at key points in the building, especially near the cooler doors. At 1 a.m., the first bell jingled. Austin froze mid-sip of his coffee, his eyes snapping to the monitor showing the hallway outside the cooler. Nothing. The bells stopped, and the fishing line was untouched. He grabbed his flashlight and walked down the hall, his boots clicking softly against the polished tile. He passed rows of closed caskets and urn displays, the air growing colder as he neared the cooler doors. The whispering started again. "Let me out." Austin gritted his teeth and approached the doors. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The whisper grew louder, turning into frantic murmurs. Then came the sound of nails scratching against metal. His hand tightened around the flashlight. He leaned closer to the door, peering through the small window. The shrouded forms of the dead remained still, except for one. A body near the back twitched. At first it was subtle, a slight shift, like a muscle spasm. But then the shroud began to writhe as if something beneath it was struggling to get free. Austin stumbled back, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. Maybe a rodent had gotten in, or it was some kind of mechanical malfunction. He forced himself to stay calm and returned to the office to watch the monitors. By 2 a.m., the bells jingled again, this time louder and longer. He rushed to the hallway, only to find the fishing line severed. A chill ran down his spine. Whatever had done this wasn't human, or at least it wasn't normal. The motion light near the cooler suddenly activated, flooding the hallway with harsh white light. Austin turned to face it, and that's when he saw the figure. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakably human-shaped. The outline of its head and shoulders shimmered faintly in the light. Austin's military training took over. He dropped into a defensive stance, raising the flashlight in one hand and reaching for the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall with the other. "Identify yourself," he barked. The figure didn't move. Austin didn't hesitate. He yanked the extinguisher free and sprayed a burst of foam toward the figure. The fine mist outlined it perfectly. A humanoid shape with arms outstretched and a twisted, contorted head. The thing let out a low, guttural growl before vanishing into thin air. Austin stumbled back, his heart racing. He sprinted to the office and locked the door behind him. His mind was a whirlwind of disbelief and fear, but he wasn't ready to give up. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Jake, I need your help," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. His old buddy Jake was the kind of guy who lived for this stuff. Ghost hunts, paranormal investigations, the works. If anyone could make sense of what was happening, it was him. "You're working at a funeral home? Dude, I'm on my way," Jake said without hesitation. Austin hung up and took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what they'd find, but he was determined to uncover the truth. It was close to 3 a.m. when Jake arrived, his beat-up truck rumbling into the parking lot. He stepped out, carrying a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and an air of excitement that made Austin shake his head. Jake was a wiry guy with an unkempt beard and an almost childlike fascination with the paranormal. "You look like you've seen a ghost, man," Jake said, grinning as he stepped inside. "Funny," Austin muttered, locking the door behind him. "Because I might have." Jake's face lit up. "Seriously? Tell me everything." Austin led Jake to the office, recounting the events of the last 2 nights. Jake listened intently, nodding at all the right moments and occasionally scribbling notes in a small journal. When Austin got to the part about the fire extinguisher and the shimmering figure, Jake leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the notebook. "That's classic residual energy," Jake said. "Spirits or echoes of past trauma. Funeral homes are prime hotspots for this kind of thing. But the cooler doors, that's weird. Did you say Carl told you not to open them?" "Yeah," Austin replied. "He was dead serious about it too." Jake frowned. "That's a red flag. Either Carl knows something he's not telling you or he's in on whatever's going on here." Austin leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think it's more than just ghosts?" Jake shrugged. "Could be. Let's set up some equipment and see what we're dealing with." From his duffel bag, Jake pulled out an array of gear. EMF detectors, motion sensors, and even a thermal imaging camera. Austin helped him set everything up, focusing on the hallway outside the cooler doors and the surrounding areas. By 3:30 a.m., they were ready. Austin resumed his rounds while Jake monitored the equipment from the office. It didn't take long for things to escalate. At 4 a.m., the EMF detector near the cooler spiked violently, the lights flashing red. Jake's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie Austin carried. "You're gonna want to see this," Jake said. Austin hurried back to the office, where Jake pointed at the thermal camera's monitor. On the screen was a faint, humanoid heat signature standing directly in front of the cooler doors. "Do you see that?" Jake whispered. Austin nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, I see it." The heat signature moved, its outline flickering as if it were struggling to stay visible. Then, as they watched, one of the cooler doors shook violently, as though something inside was pounding to get out. "Help me. Let me out." The voice was louder this time, desperate and raw. Austin turned to Jake. "We're not opening that door." "Agreed," Jake said, but his fascination was palpable. Whatever's in there is either dangerous or something way worse. Suddenly, the motion sensors Jake had placed along the hallway all activated at once, the lights flooding the area. Jake grabbed his thermal camera, and Austin grabbed the fire extinguisher again. They moved cautiously down the hall, the cooler doors looming ahead of them. "Keep your eyes open," Austin said, his voice low. As they approached the cooler, the air grew colder, each breath visible in the icy atmosphere. Jake scanned the area with his camera, the heat signatures flickering sporadically. Then it happened. A figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible to the naked eye but perfectly outlined on the thermal camera. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its head twisted unnaturally. "Don't move!" Austin hissed, raising the extinguisher. The figure took a step closer, its translucent form rippling like water. Jake's grip on the camera tightened as he whispered, "This is insane." Austin sprayed a burst of foam, illuminating the figure once again. Its mouth opened wide, though no sound came out, and its form dissolved into mist before their eyes. "What the hell was that?" Jake said, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Austin replied, his pulse pounding in his ears. "But it's not just a ghost." They retreated to the office, locking the door behind them. Jake paced back and forth, muttering to himself as he reviewed the footage. "This isn't just residual energy," Jake finally said. "There's intent behind this. These things, they're trying to get out." Austin glanced at the monitor, where the cooler doors stood still once again. "Then we make sure they don't." But deep down, he knew the night was far from over. By 4:30 a.m., the building had fallen into an eerie silence. The earlier commotion seemed to have subsided, but Austin knew better than to relax. Jake sat at the desk, poring over the thermal footage, while Austin stood guard near the office door, fire extinguisher in hand. "I've seen a lot of weird stuff in my time," Jake muttered, not looking up from the screen. "But this is something else entirely. It's almost like these things are trying to send a message." Austin frowned. "What kind of message?" Jake leaned back, his face pale but determined. "I don't know yet, but if they're desperate enough to move bodies and pound on doors, it can't be good." A loud bang echoed through the building, cutting their conversation short. It came from the cooler room. Austin clenched his jaw. "Stay here," he said, though he knew Jake wouldn't listen. He stepped into the hallway, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. Jake followed close behind, holding an EMF detector that was already spiking into the red. As they neared the cooler doors, the air grew frigid. Frost coated the edges of the metal doors, and their breath formed thick clouds in front of them. The whispering returned, louder now and overlapping as if multiple voices were speaking at once. "Help us! Let us out! They're watching!" Austin's flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. He cursed under his breath, smacking it against his palm as Jake muttered, "Classic poltergeist activity." Another bang, this time louder, shook the cooler doors. Then, to their horror, the center door creaked open a fraction of an inch. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Austin nodded, stepping closer. "Stay behind me." The EMF detector in Jake's hand was going wild, the lights flashing erratically. "This is a bad idea," he hissed. Before Austin could respond, the door swung open fully, revealing the dark interior of the cooler. The whispering stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence, and then the body at the back sat up. Austin's instincts kicked in, and he stepped back, raising the fire extinguisher. The shrouded figure turned its head slowly toward them, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Jake, get the hell out of here," Austin barked. But Jake was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. The figure slid off the metal slab, its bare feet hitting the floor with a sickening thud. It took a step forward, the shroud slipping from its face to reveal hollow eyes and gray mottled skin. Austin sprayed the fire extinguisher, the foam creating a thick mist that temporarily obscured the figure. But when the mist cleared, the body was gone. Jake finally snapped out of his trance. Did it disappear? Where did it go? Austin scanned the room, his heart pounding. "I don't know. Stay close." As they backed out of the cooler room, the motion lights in the hallway flickered on and off, casting disorienting shadows. Jake's EMF detector spiked again, and he whispered, "It's not just one. There's more of them." A low growl echoed from the end of the hallway, and both men turned to see another figure emerging from the shadows. This one was crawling on all fours, its limbs bending in unnatural directions. "Go!" Austin shouted, grabbing Jake by the arm and dragging him toward the office. They barely made it inside before slamming the door shut. Austin shoved a heavy filing cabinet in front of it, breathing hard. Jake collapsed into a chair, his face pale. "This place isn't haunted. It's cursed." Austin glared at him. "What are you talking about?" Jake hesitated, then pulled out his notebook. "I did some research on my way here. This funeral home was shut down 30 years ago after a series of accidents. Bodies went missing, employees vanished, and there were rumors of illegal experiments. They reopened under a new name, but I don't think they ever dealt with whatever's causing this." Austin sat down heavily, running a hand over his face. "So what do we do?" Jake took a deep breath. "We find out what's binding them here. Until we do, this isn't going to stop." Before Austin could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside the door. The filing cabinet shifted slightly, as if something was pushing against it. "They're not going to wait for us to figure it out," Austin said grimly, gripping the fire extinguisher. Jake nodded. "Then we'd better move fast." The pounding on the door grew louder, each strike rattling the filing cabinet. Jake fumbled through his bag, pulling out a small pouch of salt and muttering to himself. "What the hell is that for?" Austin asked, his voice strained as he braced himself against the door. "Salt lines," Jake replied hurriedly. "It's supposed to block spirits. It might buy us some time." Austin didn't argue. Time was something they desperately needed. Jake sprinkled the salt along the base of the door, and as the last grain fell into place, the pounding stopped abruptly. Silence filled the room, thick and oppressive. "Did it work?" Jake whispered. Austin didn't answer. He was already moving toward the desk, where a stack of old files sat. If the funeral home was cursed, as Jake claimed, then there had to be something in these records that could explain it. Jake joined him, flipping through the brittle pages. Most of it was routine paperwork, death certificates, embalming logs, cremation records. But then Austin found something unusual, a folder labeled Private Operations. Inside were grainy black and white photos of bodies in various stages of decomposition, each one marked with handwritten notes. Phrases like Phase 3, reanimation, and Subject unstable jumped off the page. "What the hell is this?" Austin muttered, showing the folder to Jake. Jake's face paled. "This is what I was afraid of. They weren't just preparing bodies for burial, they were experimenting on them, trying to bring them back." Austin shook his head in disbelief. "Why? Why would they do something like this?" Jake pointed to a name scrawled at the bottom of one of the documents. Dr. Elias Cartwright. Cartwright was a controversial figure in the medical community, Jake explained. He believed he could reverse death. Looks like this funeral home was his testing ground. Austin felt a chill run down his spine. "So the bodies, they're not just ghosts. They're Failed experiments, Jake finished grimly. The air grew colder, and the whispering voices returned, louder than ever. They did this to us. Free us. Burn it all. Jake grabbed Austin's arm. That's it. That's what they want. We have to destroy the bodies. Austin hesitated. The thought of opening the cooler doors was against every instinct he had. But as the whispers grew more insistent, he realized they had no choice. Fine, he said. But we're doing this my way. They armed themselves with whatever they could find. A crowbar, a fire extinguisher, and a canister of lighter fluid from the storage closet. The plan was simple. Drag the bodies out of the coolers, douse them with fluid, and light them up. When they stepped back into the hallway, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The salt line had been disturbed, and faint footprints led away from the office door. They know what we're up to, Jake said, his voice shaking. Good, Austin replied. Let them come. They reached the cooler room without incident, though the temperature dropped with every step. Frost coated the walls, and their breath came out in thick clouds. Austin gripped the crowbar, hesitating for only a moment before prying open the first cooler door. The slab inside was empty. Jake's EMF detector spiked wildly. They're not here, he said, backing away. They're moving around. Austin cursed under his breath. Then we'll have to find them. They began their grim search, moving through the darkened hallways with their makeshift weapons at the ready. The motion lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to shift and twist on their own. The first body they found was slumped in a corner near the embalming room. Its gray, lifeless eyes stared at nothing, but as Austin approached, the head jerked toward him. Nope, he muttered, spraying it with the fire extinguisher. The foam revealed its skeletal outline, giving him just enough time to douse it with lighter fluid and strike a match. The flames roared to life, and the body let out an unearthly shriek before collapsing into ash. Jake watched in horror. I hope you've got more matches. They worked quickly, moving from room to room, hunting down the restless dead. Each time the bodies resisted, jerking and twitching as if they were still clinging to some semblance of life. By the time they reached the last body, they were both drenched in sweat despite the freezing air. This one was different. It stood upright in the center of the viewing room, its hollow eyes locked on Austin. I think this one's been waiting for us, Jake whispered. Austin didn't hesitate. He sprayed the fire extinguisher, revealing the figure's grotesque, half-decayed form. But as he raised the lighter fluid, the body lunged, knocking him to the ground. Jake screamed, swinging the crowbar wildly. The blow connected and the body staggered back, giving Austin just enough time to roll to his feet. Light it up, Jake shouted. Austin struck the match and tossed it. The flames engulfed the body, and its screams echoed through the building, louder and more piercing than any of the others. As the fire died down, the oppressive cold lifted, and the whispering stopped. The air felt lighter, almost normal. Jake looked at Austin, his face pale but relieved. I think we did it. By the time the sun rose, the funeral home was quiet. The bodies were gone, reduced to ash, and the strange phenomena had ceased. Austin sat on the front steps, staring at the horizon as Jake packed up his gear. You know, Jake said, you're probably going to need a new job. Austin snorted. Yeah, no kidding. They sat in silence for a moment before Jake added, I have to admit, this was one hell of a night. Austin nodded. Let's make sure it's the last one. With that, they walked away, leaving the cursed funeral home behind.